What happened to the cast of Expedition X is something nobody saw coming. Jessica Chobot, Phil Torres, and the rest of the team built one of the most daring paranormal investigation franchises on television, chasing the unknown across the world. But behind the cameras, things were falling apart in ways that shocked even their most devoted fans. Before this video is over, you will not believe what happened to Josh Gates. Stay with us. The full story starts right now. Expedition X was not supposed to be just another paranormal show. When it first premiered on Discovery Plus, it felt like something the genre had been waiting years for. A series that combined genuine scientific investigation with the kind of atmosphere and tension that made viewers feel like something real was at stake every single episode. Jessica Chobot and Phil Torres were not ghost hunters in the traditional sense. They were investigators in the truest meaning of the word, traveling to some of the most remote and dangerous locations on the planet in pursuit of answers that most television producers would not have had the courage to chase. The show built a devoted audience quickly, and for good reason. Every investigation felt like it mattered. Every piece of evidence felt like it had been earned rather than staged. Fans who had grown tired of the manufactured drama and scripted reactions that dominated the paranormal space found something in Expedition X that felt genuinely different. This was a show that respected its audience enough to take the mystery seriously. It did not insult viewers with fake jump scares and convenient technical malfunctions designed to fill runtime. It went to the locations, it did the actual work, and it let the evidence speak for itself without dressing it up in artificial tension that the genre had become addicted to. The cast had real chemistry, real curiosity, and a willingness to be genuinely uncomfortable in pursuit of something that might actually change the way people thought about the unexplained. Seasons came and went, and the fan base only grew more devoted. Episode after episode, viewers tuned in not just for the atmosphere, but for the sense that they were watching people who actually believed in what they were doing. That belief was contagious in a way that cannot be manufactured. And then, without warning, without explanation, and without anything resembling a proper goodbye, it was gone. The social media accounts went quiet mid-cycle. The network released no statement of any real substance to the audience that had given the show years of their loyalty. Fans who had been following the series since its earliest episodes were left refreshing pages, checking schedules, and finding nothing but silence where something they loved used to live. The comment sections filled rapidly with confusion, concern, and the particular grief that comes when something disappears before it has been given a proper ending. What most of those fans did not know at the time was that the disappearance of the show was not even close to the strangest or most troubling part of this story. The strangest part was what had already been happening to the people in front of those cameras long before the show went quiet. The truth about what this cast endured is something the network never wanted discussed, and it starts with one name. What Jessica Chobot has been living through while the world was not paying attention will change the way you see everything about this series. Her story is next. Jessica Chobot built one of the most distinctive careers in entertainment by refusing to fit neatly into any single category the industry tried to place her in. She came up through gaming media at a time when women in that space were rare and rarely taken seriously, and she built her credibility through sheer force of intelligence, presence, and an authenticity that audiences recognized and responded to immediately. By the time she landed on Expedition X, she had already proven herself across multiple platforms and multiple formats, and her presence on the show sent a signal to viewers that this was a project worth investing in. She was not there to scream in dark hallways for the camera. She was not a prop placed beside the more traditionally adventurous elements of the production to give it a particular look. She was there because she was genuinely and deeply curious about the unknown and willing to go further than most people in her position would ever consider going in pursuit of answers that might actually mean something. What the audience saw on screen was real. The curiosity was real. The discomfort was real. The commitment to getting it right was real. But what was happening off screen behind the version of Jessica Chobot that viewers saw every episode was a different story entirely, one that has never been fully told. Behind the confident and composed exterior she brought to every investigation, Chobot was navigating a set of personal and professional pressures that would have broken most people working inside the same industry. The toll of years of high-demand paranormal production, the relentless international travel, the brutal physical conditions in locations that do not accommodate human comfort, the psychological weight of repeatedly placing yourself in situations specifically engineered to destabilize your perception of reality, is something that paranormal television has almost never been willing to acknowledge publicly. For Chobot, those pressures did not exist in isolation from each other. They were compounding across multiple seasons, building quietly on top of one another into something that could not be sustained at the pace the production demanded. People who followed her closely on social media began to notice small but telling changes over time. The energy shifted. The posts came less frequently. The interviews she gave carried a different quality behind her eyes than they had in earlier years. Fans who had been paying close attention started raising questions in comment sections that nobody in any official capacity was answering. And through all of it, through every sign that something was becoming unsustainable, Chobot kept showing up, kept delivering, and kept carrying a show that depended on her presence far more heavily than most viewers ever realized or would have guessed. That level of professionalism always has a price. The version of Jessica Chobot that existed in the later seasons of Expedition X was someone operating well past any reasonable limit, in service of a production that never adequately acknowledged what it was asking of her. What her situation actually looks like in 2026 is not what anyone watching her at her peak would have seen coming. Phil Torres is next, and his story is one that unfolded in almost complete silence. That silence is what makes it so devastating. Phil Torres brought something to Expedition X that the paranormal genre had almost never been able to produce before and has not been able to replicate since. His background in entomology gave him a scientific framework that the vast majority of investigators operating in this space simply do not possess. And he used that framework not to dismiss the unknown or to deflate the atmosphere the show was built around, but to approach every investigation with a genuine rigor that made its findings feel credible in a way that was genuinely rare. When Torres said something was worth investigating, it carried real weight because the audience understood that he was not saying it for dramatic effect. When he pushed back on a piece of evidence or raised a methodological concern, it was not a scripted moment of manufactured skepticism. It was the honest output of a trained scientific mind doing exactly what it was trained to do. That combination of genuine expertise and authentic curiosity was not incidental to what Expedition X was. It was foundational. He was the reason a viewer who might otherwise have dismissed the show as entertainment could find themselves taking it seriously. The show needed what Torres brought to it more than it ever fully communicated to the audience watching at home. And then the show ended. And Phil Torres, the man who had given the paranormal genre something it had never previously possessed, found himself navigating an industry that did not quite know how to value someone like him once the specific context that had made him visible disappeared. The trajectory of his career after Expedition X is not a story of dramatic failure or public collapse. It is something quieter and in many ways more troubling than that. It is the story of a genuinely talented and credentialed person finding that the television industry's interest in what he had to offer was shallower than the years he gave to it deserved. The projects that looked like opportunities revealed themselves to be less than they appeared. The doors that should have been open on the strength of his track record turned out to be considerably harder to push through than they had any right to be. He retreated from public view in stages that his longtime followers watched with a mixture of concern and frustration. Frustration not at Torres, but at a system that consistently fails to retain the people who bring it the most actual value. His social media presence, once engaged and active, became sparse. His name stopped appearing in lineups and announcements. The conversation moved forward without him in any meaningful role. What makes this story particularly difficult to sit with is how utterly preventable it feels. This was not a person who made enemies or squandered goodwill or ran out of things to contribute. This was someone who gave a genre genuine credibility and received diminishing returns on that investment until the machine moved on without acknowledgement or accountability. In 2026, the distance between where Phil Torres' career should be and where it actually is represents one of the quieter tragedies in the entire Expedition X story. Coming up, the decisions made behind closed doors that made all of this inevitable. While Jessica Chobot and Phil Torres were delivering their best work in front of the cameras, something very different was happening in the offices where the actual decisions about Expedition X got made. The story of what went wrong with this show is not only the story of what its cast experienced personally, it is also the story of an institution, a network that did not understand what it had, did not take adequate steps to protect it, and ultimately allowed it to deteriorate under the weight of priorities that had nothing to do with the quality of the content or the loyalty of the audience that had been built around it. Expedition X existed inside a television landscape that was changing faster than anyone in a position of authority seemed capable of adapting to in real time. The streaming wars had fundamentally altered what networks needed from their original content and how they evaluated whether a show was earning its place in the schedule. The economics of serious documentary production were being compressed from every direction simultaneously. Shows that required real international travel budgets, genuine and often difficult location access, and the kind of specialized expert personnel that Torres represented were becoming increasingly difficult to justify on spreadsheets that were being recalibrated to reward cheap production and guaranteed viral engagement over substance, craft, and the slow accumulation of a deeply loyal audience. The people making those spreadsheet decisions were not spending time in the comment sections where fans were declaring their commitment to the show. They were not reading the forums where viewers were dissecting every episode with genuine investment. They were looking at numbers in isolation and making projections that failed to account for the kind of long-building audience devotion that Expedition X had quietly earned season after season. The result of those projections was a series of decisions that the cast felt in their work before they understood what was causing the shift. Production timelines tightened without explanation. Resources that had previously been available were quietly reduced. Episodes that deserved the space and the budget to be executed properly were compressed into formats that could not contain what they were supposed to deliver. Investigations that warranted real follow-up were closed out before meaningful conclusions could be reached. The audience sensed the change, even without being able to name it precisely. The show that appeared in its later seasons carried a different texture than the one they had fallen in love with, not because the cast had stopped caring, but because the infrastructure behind them had been systematically reduced in ways they had no control over and no platform to address publicly. Through all of it, the network offered no transparency, no public acknowledgement, and no accountability to the audience that had made the show worth funding in the first place. The people who paid the price for those decisions were the ones whose faces were on camera, and for one of them, the price went well beyond professional frustration. That story is next. There is a conversation that paranormal television has never been willing to have in any sustained or honest way, and it is this one. The work is not safe, not physically, not psychologically, and not in any of the ways that matter most to the long-term well-being of the people who do it. The locations are real. The conditions in those locations are real. The sleep deprivation that comes with shooting in remote environments on tight production schedules is real. The psychological accumulation of repeatedly placing yourself in situations specifically engineered to destabilize your sense of reality and your relationship to the physical world is real, and it does not simply evaporate when the cameras stop rolling and the crew packs up and flies home. For the cast of Expedition X, that accumulation had a cost that the production never publicly acknowledged, and that the network had every institutional incentive to keep out of public conversation. Behind the polished episodes that aired, behind the investigations that made it through the editing process and onto the screen, there were human beings absorbing experiences that the majority of the people watching at home will never come close to in their lifetimes. Some of those experiences were remarkable in ways that justified every difficult moment that surrounded them, but others left marks that did not fade the way the production schedule assumed they would. Health challenges that developed during the course of the show's run were navigated privately because the culture of television production provides almost no structural space for vulnerability, especially from the people whose names are on the call sheet. Personal crises that landed directly on top of shooting schedules were managed quietly because the machine does not stop moving simply because one of the people inside it has reached or exceeded their limit. Viewers at home received a finished product that gave no indication of what it had cost to assemble. The professionalism of this cast was so thorough that the cracks were nearly impossible to see from the outside. Nearly. People who followed the cast closely, who paid attention to the signals that appear in interviews and social media and the subtle changes in the way someone carries themselves on screen when something is wrong, began putting pieces together that the network would have strongly preferred to leave scattered. What was actually happening to members of this team during some of the show's most celebrated episodes is a story that has never been told completely or publicly. It involves the kind of experience that changes a person in ways that do not resolve cleanly and do not leave the person who lived through it the same on the other side. In 2026, the effects of what this cast absorbed during production remain visible for anyone paying the right kind of attention. The show ended. The network moved on. The cameras were packed away. The experiences those cameras captured stayed with the people who lived them. And the biggest story in this entire video is still directly ahead. Josh Gates is coming. But there is one more chapter inside the show itself that reframes everything that came before it. There is one investigation in the run of Expedition X that fans return to more consistently than any other, not because it produced the most conclusive evidence, not because it generated the most dramatic footage or the most talked about moment in the show's history, but because in retrospect, Knowing everything that has since become clear about the condition of the show and the state of the people making it, that episode takes on a meaning that nobody watching at the time could have anticipated or understood. It aired during what appeared on the surface to be one of the show's more stable and confident stretches. The production value was high. The location was genuinely compelling in the way that the best Expedition X episodes always were. Chobot and Torres were performing at a level that reminded even casual viewers exactly why they had connected with this show in the first place. What the audience watching at home did not know was that the people delivering that performance were doing so under conditions behind the scenes that had no business existing in the form they existed in. The tension that reads on screen as the natural intensity of a genuine investigation was absolutely real, but not entirely for the reasons that the editing constructed around it. There were unresolved conflicts happening during that production that never surfaced in any public way. There were decisions being made several layers above the investigators on the ground that directly shaped what they were able to pursue, what evidence they were permitted to present, and what version of the investigation the audience was ultimately going to see. There was a cut of that episode, a version of that investigation that, according to people with direct knowledge of the production, told a substantially different story than the one that eventually aired. Fans who revisited that episode after the show ended started noticing details they had glossed over the first time. Moments where the energy between cast members carried a weight that the surrounding narrative could not fully account for. Exchanges that felt slightly compressed, slightly loaded, as though something was being held precisely at the surface without being allowed to break through. Those viewers were not wrong about what they were sensing. Something was being held back, not by the investigators themselves, who by all accounts wanted to show the audience everything they had found, but by a layer of production and network oversight that had its own reasons for the shape the final episode took. In 2026, that investigation still occupies a particular place in the memory of the show's most committed fans. Not as a triumph, and not as a failure either, but as a document of what the show was capable of producing even when the conditions surrounding it were working against it. The cast gave everything to that location. What they received in return was considerably less than what they had put in. That imbalance defined the final chapter of Expedition X more than anything else, and it led directly to what came next for the people who had carried it. When Expedition X went quiet, so did the people who made it. One by one, the social media accounts went dormant. Projects hinted at in interviews never materialized. Names that had been fixtures in the paranormal documentary world stopped appearing in lineups without explanation. Fans noticed every change, and they noticed it fast. Comment sections on archived episodes filled with questions nobody was answering. Reddit threads became places where devoted viewers pieced together fragments. A liked post here, a missing update there, trying to understand what had happened to a cast they had followed for years. In 2026, some have found new footing in adjacent spaces, some are still searching for it, and some have gone so completely quiet that the silence itself has become the story. The full picture of where this cast landed has never been placed in front of the people who care most. Until this video, Josh Gates is next, and his story is what this entire video has been building toward. The final episodes of Expedition X aired without any acknowledgement that they were final. No conclusion was built with the awareness that a conclusion was coming. No moment existed where the show honored the audience that had given it years of loyalty with anything resembling a proper goodbye. It simply stopped. The silence deepened and became permanent without ever being officially declared. Fans organized petitions, flooded network inboxes, shared clips from favorite episodes like eulogies. None of it produced a real response. The network said nothing of substance. The show that spent its entire run chasing answers in the dark ended exactly the same way, without resolution and without the honesty its audience had earned. In 2026, that wound is still open, and nobody has felt the weight of it more personally or for longer than the man this video has been building toward from the start. Josh Gates is next. This is the part you came here for. Josh Gates is the closest thing the world of adventure documentary television has ever produced to a genuine and enduring icon. His career spans decades and encompasses hundreds of episodes across multiple franchises, and the identity he has built around his name represents something that almost nobody else in this genre has managed to sustain. A level of audience trust so deep and so durable that it has survived format changes, network transitions, platform shifts, and the relentless churn of an industry that creates and discards its personalities with a speed that leaves most of them unrecognizable within a few years of their peak. Gates built that trust slowly and deliberately, one expedition at a time, by consistently showing up to the most remote and difficult locations on Earth and treating the audience watching from home as genuine partners in the process of discovery rather than passive consumers of packaged spectacle. The relationship he built with the people who followed his work across franchises was not manufactured. It was earned over years of showing up and delivering. And it is the reason that what has been happening in his world in 2026 carries so much more weight than a similar story about almost anyone else operating in this space would. His connection to Expedition X, as a producer, as the institutional force behind the universe the show existed within, meant that when the show began to fracture, the effects of that fracture reached him in ways that the audience never fully saw. The status of Expedition Unknown, the flagship franchise that Gates has commanded for more than a decade, has entered a period of genuine uncertainty that his most devoted viewers have found deeply unsettling to witness from the outside. The questions surrounding its future, the network relationship that has defined the central chapter of his professional life, the format he has refined over years into something singular, do not resolve cleanly or quickly in 2026. Behind those professional uncertainties are personal dimensions that Gates has addressed only in the careful language of someone who has spent years learning to control what the camera is allowed to see. Reading between what he has said publicly, the picture that assembles itself is of a man who has given more to this genre than the genre has found ways to return, who is navigating a period of profound transition with the same determination he has brought to every expedition he has ever led, and who is doing so with considerably less institutional support than his body of work should have generated. The version of Josh Gates that exists in 2026 is not diminished. He is not finished, and he is not out of things to pursue, but he is in a chapter of his own story that is harder and more uncertain than anything his audience has watched him face on screen. And unlike every expedition he has ever documented, this one does not come with a production budget or a camera crew to bear witness to what it costs. He is navigating it the way all of us eventually must, without a guaranteed outcome, without a map, and without the ability to cut away when the moment becomes difficult to hold. The cast of Expedition X deserved better than the ending they received. The audience that loved this show deserved better than the silence that replaced it. If this video gave you the story nobody else was willing to tell, subscribe. There is always more. Discovery Channel has never shied away from what Expedition X produces: remote locations, extreme conditions, evidence that pushes the boundaries of what mainstream documentary television is willing to put in front of an audience. They have broadcast all of it without hesitation across every prior season. Then one episode disappeared. Not canceled, not postponed. Disappeared, pulled before broadcast and buried for years, while the show kept running as though it never existed. It has just surfaced. Subscribe and stay until the very end. Expedition X exists in a specific and important position in the paranormal documentary landscape that separates it from everything else the genre has produced. It is not a ghost hunting show. It is not a property-based mystery series organized around a single location's anomalous history. It is a field investigation program built around the premise that the phenomena most worth investigating are the ones that mainstream science has declined to engage with seriously, not because the evidence for their reality is inadequate, but because the institutional frameworks within which mainstream science operates create powerful disincentives for the kind of sustained, open-ended field investigation that the evidence actually requires. Phil Torres and Jessica Chobot have built their respective contributions to the show on foundations whose credibility is independent of the paranormal television format. Torres brings the methodological training of a working field scientist whose prior research career in tropical biology gave him the framework to distinguish genuine biological anomalies from misidentification, and whose willingness to apply that framework honestly, including to findings whose honest application produces conclusions that his scientific background did not prepare him to reach, gives the show's positive findings a weight that a credulous presenter's enthusiasm cannot claim. Chobot brings the investigative instincts of a journalist and media professional whose sustained engagement with the communities and the witnesses who populate the paranormal investigation landscape has given her an understanding of how genuine encounter testimony differs from the culturally shaped accounts that the skeptical literature uses to dismiss witness evidence as a category. Together, they have taken the show into environments and investigated phenomena that the the mainstream media and the mainstream scientific community have consistently avoided, not because those environments and phenomena do not produce evidence, but because the evidence they produce is of a character that the institutional frameworks of the mainstream cannot receive without consequences. Those institutions are not willing to accept. The banned episode is the most direct documentation of what happens when an investigation goes further than any institutional framework can contain. It is what the show has always been building toward, and what Discovery Channel determined upon reviewing its footage that the audience could not be shown. The investigation documented in the banned episode was not organized through the standard Expedition X production process of location research, witness contact development, and advanced field assessment that shapes most of the show's investigation deployments. It was organized around intelligence, a specific body of information that reached the production through a source whose institutional background placed them in a position to know things about the investigation target that the standard research process would not have uncovered, and whose conditions for sharing that information with the production communicated something specific about the sensitivity of what they were sharing. The source made contact with the production outside of normal channels. Their communication was routed through an intermediary whose relationship to the production was established enough to give the initial contact credibility, and whose own assessment of what the source was sharing was communicated in terms that the production's leadership took seriously before the source's own account was fully evaluated. What the source provided was a geographic location, a category of phenomenon associated with it, and a body of contextual information about the location's prior investigation history that the standard research process, FOIA requests, academic literature review, witness database searches, would not have produced. The contextual information was significant in a way that the standard research process's outputs are not typically significant for Expedition X. It described prior investigation of the location by parties whose institutional affiliations the source referenced without fully naming, affiliations whose character the production's leadership assessed as governmental rather than academic or journalistic, prior investigation by institutional parties whose findings had not entered any public record, prior investigation that had apparently produced findings significant enough that the source's decision to share the location with a television production was described by the intermediary as representing a considered judgment that the information needed to reach a public audience regardless of the institutional preferences that had kept it out of the public record until that point. Torres and Chobot were briefed on the full source communication before the decision to deploy was made. Their individual responses to the briefing have been described in accounts of the production's internal communications during the planning phase as consistent with what people who have spent careers investigating the edges of the known world produce. When they encounter something that suggests the edges are closer to the center than they had previously understood, they decided to go. What they found when they got there is what Discovery Channel has spent years making sure nobody saw. The location investigated in the banned episode has a documented history of anomalous activity that the Expedition X research team was able to partially reconstruct from the public record before the investigation deployed. Partially because the most significant elements of the location's investigation history are not in the public record and were accessed only through the source communication that organized the investigation in the first place. What the public record portion of the research produced was consistent enough across independent sources and specific enough in its behavioral descriptions to establish the location as genuinely anomalous before the source's contextual information was added. Witness accounts from the surrounding community spanning multiple decades described phenomenon at the location with a consistency across independent observers, separated by significant spans of time that the cultural transmission explanation, one witness influencing another's account through shared cultural narrative, could not account for. The accounts were too specific, too behaviorally detailed, and too consistent across observers who had no documented connection to each other to be products of shared mythology rather than shared observation. The indigenous traditions of the communities whose ancestral territory includes the location described it in terms whose practical specificity, behavioral instructions about how to relate to the location, specific seasonal patterns of activity, particular physical features of the terrain whose anomalous character was treated as established fact rather than cultural embellishment, indicated a body of accumulated observational knowledge rather than a body of mythology. Those traditions were documented by anthropologists whose fieldwork in the region predated any of the modern encounter reports, giving the research team independent verification that the location's anomalous character was recognized before any contemporary paranormal investigation culture could have shaped the community's perception of it. What the source's contextual information added to this baseline was the specific history of institutional investigation, the prior engagement by parties whose governmental affiliations the source referenced, and the specific character of what that investigation had found, not the findings themselves, which the source declined to describe in detail, the fact of their existence and the fact of their suppression, and one specific detail about the nature of what the institutional investigation had encountered at the location that the source communicated as the reason the production needed to be prepared for what it might find there. That detail, the one thing the source told the production to be ready for, is what the banned episode documents the team encountering, and it is what Discovery Channel's editorial review determined could not be broadcast under any framework the network possessed. The Expedition X team arrived at the investigation location with a preparation level that Torres has described in the limited indirect references to the investigation available outside the production's internal record as the most extensive the show had ever brought to a single deployment, not in terms of equipment. The standard Expedition X investigative toolkit was deployed without significant modification from prior investigation configurations. In terms of personal preparation, in terms of the specific investment both Torres and Chobot had made in understanding what the location's prior history suggested about what the investigation might encounter, and in ensuring that their own frameworks, Torres's scientific methodology, Chobot's investigative approach to witness engagement and community relationship, were calibrated to the specific demands the location's character appeared to make. Torres's pre-deployment research into the location's contextual history produced in him a quality of focused attention that the show's prior investigation deployments had not required in quite the same way. The prior Expedition X investigations had always asked him to bring his scientific framework to bear on phenomena whose character was established enough in the prior evidence record that his framework had a specific application. Biological analysis of cryptid encounter evidence, physical analysis of structural anomalies, environmental analysis of atmospheric or geological explanations for reported phenomenon. The banned episode location asked him to bring his scientific framework to bear on something whose character the prior evidence record had established was outside the range that the framework was designed to address. That demand, the demand to apply rigorous scientific methodology to a phenomenon whose character appeared to exceed the methodology's explanatory reach, is the specific professional challenge that the banned episode investigation represented for Torres, and that accounts for the quality of his engagement with it that the people who have reviewed the episode's footage have described with consistency. He did not respond to that challenge by softening his methodology. He applied it with the full rigor his training had produced. What the rigor produced in the specific conditions the location created is what makes the banned episode significant in a way that prior Expedition X investigations, extraordinary as many of them were, did not achieve. The methodology met the phenomenon at full strength, and the phenomenon exceeded the methodology in a way that the cameras documented completely. The investigation's first active session produced evidence across multiple independent categories that the Expedition X team documented with the systematic rigor that Torres's scientific framework demanded, and whose combined significance the team processed in real time, with the quality of controlled professional attention that their individual expertise and their collective field experience had developed. The environmental baseline established during the investigation's opening phase identified characteristics of the location's physical environment that departed from the reference data the team had prepared from the available geological and atmospheric literature for the region. The electromagnetic field readings across the location showed a pattern of elevation whose geographic distribution corresponded to specific features of the terrain that the prior witness accounts had consistently identified as the focal points of the location's most intense reported activity, a correspondence that established a connection between the historically active zones and a measurable physical characteristic of those zones that the team's instruments could track independently of the witness testimony. The acoustic monitoring produced the first anomalous finding of the active investigation phase within the opening hours of the session. recordings in the infrasound frequency range whose structural characteristics the team's audio specialist identified as organized rather than random. Organized infrasound is not impossible in natural environments. The specific organization of what the location's acoustic monitoring produced, the internal patterning, the temporal structure, and the specific relationship between the infrasound recordings and the locations of maximum electromagnetic field elevation, was not consistent with any natural source the team's analysis identified. The biological evidence documented during the first phase is the category whose implications Torres has been most careful about in the indirect references to the investigation that have been available outside the production record. Physical trace evidence at specific locations within the investigation area, whose forensic characteristics the team documented in place before any collection was attempted, characteristics that Torres assessed in real time with the methodological standard his field biology background demanded, placed the evidence outside the range of any known species in the regional biological record, not close to the boundary of that range, outside it in a manner whose clarity his professional assessment did not qualify with uncertainty. What produced that evidence was at the location when the team arrived. The first phase established that. What the second phase established was something whose documentation is what the banned episode contains, and whose contents Discovery Channel determined the audience could not be shown. The specific sequence of events during the investigation's second phase that produced the footage Discovery Channel reviewed and removed from every accessible production archive is the centerpiece of what the banned episode contains and the element of the surfaced footage that has been described by the people who have reviewed it with a consistency whose specific character communicates more about what the footage shows than any direct description the review subjects have been willing to provide. The sequence begins with a change in the investigation's environmental monitoring data that the team detected in real time during the second active session, a change that Torres' scientific framework identified immediately as significant and that Chobot's investigative instinct registered simultaneously in the behavioral shift it produced in the location's surrounding environment. The electromagnetic field readings across the monitoring network underwent a reorganization whose speed and whose geographic pattern the team's technical specialist characterized in the session's real-time communication record as unlike anything in the prior investigation's baseline data or in the reference literature for comparable environmental monitoring scenarios. The infrasound monitoring registered a simultaneous transition whose character, the shift from the organized but relatively stable pattern the first phase had established to something whose internal structure the audio specialist described as directional, indicated a change in the source of what the acoustic monitoring had been tracking. Something had moved, not in the sense of an animal changing position within a territory, in the sense of whatever had been generating the organized infrasound signal relocating from wherever it had been generating it to somewhere closer to the investigation team's position. The cameras documented what followed. Every unit running during the second phase captured the relevant sequence from independent angles whose overlapping coverage eliminates the single camera artifact explanation that the skeptical literature applies to anomalous footage whose content a single camera might be credited with misrepresenting. What the overlapping coverage of multiple independent cameras documented in the relevant sequence is what the review of the surfaced footage has produced consistent descriptions of, consistent not in their specific visual detail, which the review subjects have declined to provide, but in their characterization of the sequence's evidential quality. It is unambiguous. It does not require expert commentary to establish its significance. It does not benefit from production enhancement to communicate what it shows. It is the kind of footage whose significance is immediately apparent to anyone watching it, and whose implications do not require analysis to access. That is why Discovery Channel buried it, and that is why its surfacing changes everything. The Expedition X banned episode footage was reviewed by Discovery Channel within the standard post-production timeline that the show's delivery schedule established for completed episode packages. What distinguished the subsequent process from every prior Expedition X episode's post-production pathway was the specific point at which the footage's escalation to the network's executive level occurred, and the specific character of the response that escalation produced. The standard Discovery Channel editorial process for Expedition X involved the network's programming team reviewing assembled episode cuts whose production had already passed through the show's internal editorial process, a review oriented toward content standards, scheduling fit, and the episodic narrative quality that the network's programming judgment assessed against its audience expectations. The banned episode footage did not reach that standard review process. It was escalated before assembly, before the production had produced an edited episode cut from the raw investigation footage. Someone in the production's internal review chain reviewed the raw footage, reached a conclusion about its contents that the standard internal editorial process was not equipped to manage, and escalated to the network's executive level before the normal post-production workflow had advanced to the assembly stage. The network's response to the escalation was made at an organizational level whose involvement in the editorial decisions of individual Expedition X episodes had no prior precedent in the show's production history. The decision was not made by the programming executives whose standard role in the network's relationship with the show gave them authority over content and scheduling decisions. It was made above them by people whose organizational position indicated that the decision was being treated as something other than a programming content call. What the decision communicated, the instruction that came back to the production, the specific terms in which the footage's suppression was mandated, and the speed with which the instruction was delivered relative to the escalation that triggered it, is what Torres and Chobot received as the official account of why the episode would not be broadcast. Neither of them has publicly characterized the official account as adequate to what the footage contained. Their silence about the investigation in the years since the suppression decision is the most direct communication they have made about their assessment of the account's adequacy, and the surfacing of the episode, the fact that the footage survived the suppression effort and has now reached an audience, is the most direct refutation of the account's claimed finality. The Expedition X banned episode footage that has surfaced represents the complete raw investigation record from the banned episode investigation, not an edited cut assembled for broadcast, not a curated selection of the most dramatic segments, but the unedited camera output from every unit running across both active investigation phases. Its authenticity has been assessed through the digital forensics process applied to the file, production metadata consistent with the Expedition X production timeline, camera identification data matching the equipment manifest for the relevant deployment, and the absence of post-production manipulation signatures that forensic imaging analysis identifies in altered footage. What the surfaced footage establishes, in the terms that can be responsibly claimed on the basis of the footage's actual contents, rather than the dramatic characterizations that the context of its suppression might encourage, is a body of investigation documentation whose evidential quality exceeds anything in the Expedition X broadcast record across the show's prior seasons. The environmental monitoring data captured in the footage across both active investigation phases is real instrument data whose values are documented in the recording and whose significance the footage's scientific context. Torres's real-time analytical engagement with the readings as they were produced establishes within the investigation's own methodological framework. The physical evidence documentation is real forensic documentation whose methodology is visible in the footage and whose results Torres's assessment characterizes in real-time terms that reflect his professional standard rather than his enthusiasm. The acoustic recording is real audio whose frequency content is captured in the footage's audio track and whose structural characteristics the footage documents Torres and the audio specialist analyzing in real time with the specific quality of professional attention that significant findings produce in people whose careers have been built on the rigorous assessment of exactly this category of data. And the visual documentation of what the cameras captured during the second phase's relevant sequence is real footage, confirmed authentic by forensic analysis, captured by multiple independent units whose overlapping coverage eliminates artifact explanation, and documented in conditions whose clarity the prior Expedition X broadcast record has not matched in any investigation the show has previously conducted. What the footage does not establish, what the responsible characterization of its contents cannot claim on the basis of what it shows, is a conclusion about the nature of what it documents. That conclusion requires analysis that the footage enables but does not itself contain. The analysis is ongoing. The footage is now available to support it. Discovery Channel built Expedition X around the premise that the phenomena most worth investigating are the ones mainstream science has declined to engage with. Phil Torres and Jessica Chobot spent seasons proving that premise correct. The banned episode is where the premise arrived at its destination, where the investigation went further than any institutional framework could contain, and the cameras documented what was waiting there with a clarity and a completeness that the prior broadcast record has never matched. The network buried it because what it shows does not require analysis to understand. It requires a response. And a response to what the footage shows is something that Discovery Channel and every institution whose frameworks would be implicated by that response was not willing to produce. The footage has now surfaced. The forensics confirm it is real. The investigation that produced it was conducted by people whose credibility is independent of the paranormal television format and what the cameras documented during the second phase of that investigation, across multiple independent units, in conditions whose clarity the suppression effort was apparently designed to prevent from becoming permanent, is now available to everyone. The suppression was designed to keep it from. The analysis is ongoing. The footage is no longer buried. What it shows has been waiting to be seen. It has now been seen. Expedition X built its reputation going further than any other paranormal investigation show on television. Real locations, real field work, real evidence, which makes what happened to their banned episode so significant, because this is not a show that manufactures drama. When an entire episode was pulled before a single viewer could watch it, it was not pulled for being too sensational. It was pulled for being too real. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what surfaces in this video is the footage they spent years making sure you would never see. To understand why the banned episode of Expedition X carries the weight that it does, it is necessary to first understand what separates this production from every other paranormal documentary series operating in the same television landscape. The paranormal genre has never been short of content. Cable television has spent decades producing an unbroken stream of ghost hunting programs, cryptid investigations, and property-based mystery series that follow broadly similar formulas: dramatic music, night vision cameras, investigators reacting to ambiguous sounds in the dark. Expedition X was built in deliberate opposition to that formula from the beginning. The show's foundational premise is that the phenomena worth investigating are not confined to allegedly haunted American properties accessible by a production van and a film permit. They exist in remote corners of the world where local populations have been reporting extraordinary experiences for generations, where the evidence has never been systematically examined because no outside institution has ever committed the resources to reach the location, and where the absence of a television-ready environment is precisely what makes the investigation credible. Phil Torres is the scientific anchor of that premise. His background as a field biologist and naturalist gives the show a methodological framework that most paranormal productions conspicuously lack. Torres approaches anomalous evidence the way a trained scientist approaches any data set, with a genuine commitment to eliminating conventional explanations before entertaining unconventional ones, and with the professional discipline to document findings accurately even when those findings resist the frameworks he brought to the investigation. That discipline is what makes his presence in the banned footage so significant. Jessica Chobot brings a different but complementary dimension to the production. Her investigative instincts are oriented toward the human side of the phenomena the show documents: the witnesses, the communities, the generations of reported experience that predate any outside investigation and that carry a weight of accumulated testimony that laboratory methodology alone cannot fully account for. Her ability to build trust with local sources in environments where outside investigators are typically regarded with suspicion has consistently produced testimony and access for Expedition X that other productions simply cannot replicate. Together, Torres and Chobot have taken the show into environments that range from the jungles of South America to the coastlines of the Pacific to the high-altitude regions of Central Asia, documenting phenomena that include unidentified aerial objects, cryptid encounters reported by credible witnesses across multiple generations, and physical locations where the documented history of anomalous activity stretches back further than any living person's memory. The show has earned a reputation within the paranormal research community and among the scientists and anthropologists who occasionally collaborate with the production for taking its subject matter seriously and for producing documentation that holds up to scrutiny. That reputation is the foundation on which the banned episode's significance rests. A production known for manufacturing drama banning an episode tells you nothing. A production known for rigorous fieldwork banning an episode tells you that the fieldwork produced something that the entire apparatus of professional television was not equipped to broadcast. The investigation that generated the banned footage did not originate through the standard development process that produces most Expedition X episodes. It did not come from a researcher identifying a promising location in the existing paranormal literature, or from a network development conversation about what regions or phenomena would perform well with the show's audience in a given season. It came from a source inside a research institution whose professional relationship with the production had generated reliable leads in the past, a source who made contact with with the production outside of normal channels and under conditions of significant personal caution, indicating that what they were passing along was not information they were comfortable transmitting through any traceable pathway. What that source provided was a documented account of a location that had been the subject of classified institutional interest for a period spanning several decades. The nature of that interest, the identity of the institutions involved, and the specific findings that had accumulated across those decades of observation were not fully disclosed in the initial contact. What was disclosed was enough: a geographic location, a category of phenomenon, and a body of witness testimony from the local population of the region that was consistent across independent accounts separated by generations of time. The production team that evaluated the lead spent several weeks assessing its credibility before any commitment to pursue it was made. The geographic location checked out against independent sources. The witness testimony could be partially corroborated through existing anthropological records that predated any institutional interest in the site, and the category of phenomenon the source described was one that Expedition X had documented evidence of in adjacent regions during prior investigations, giving the production a legitimate methodological basis for treating the lead as worthy of serious field investigation. The internal discussions about whether to proceed carried a quality that production veterans on the show have described as unlike anything in their prior experience on the series. There was no shortage of enthusiasm for pursuing the investigation. The lead was compelling by any measure the production applied to it. The caution came from a different place. The source's manner of making contact, the institutional background they referenced, and the specific conditions they placed on how the information could be used all communicated something that experienced television producers are not accustomed to factoring into their decisions. They communicated genuine risk. The decision to proceed was made with that risk fully acknowledged. The team was assembled, the location was arranged, and the cameras were packed for an investigation that everyone involved understood from the outset was operating in territory that the show's prior fieldwork had not fully prepared them for. What none of them fully anticipated was how quickly, once they were on the ground at that location, the territory would make that clear on its own terms. Phil Torres has given hundreds of interviews across his career as a field scientist and television presenter. He is articulate, precise, and comfortable discussing the full range of phenomena Expedition X has documented, including the cases that most challenged his scientific framework. There is one investigation he does not discuss. When questions in interviews have approached the territory of the banned episode, through indirect references to a specific period in the show's production timeline, through questions about whether he has ever encountered something in the field that genuinely exceeded his scientific framework, rather than simply challenging it, Torres's responses shift in a way that is consistent and recognizable. He does not deflect with humor. He does not offer the standard paranormal television presenter's answer about keeping an open mind. He redirects with a deliberateness that reads less like media training and more like a decision made in advance about a specific subject that he has concluded cannot be addressed in a public forum. Jessica Chobot's public record around the same period shows a parallel pattern. A presenter who has always been willing to engage directly with the audience about her experiences in the field, including experiences that unsettled her, went notably quiet on the specifics of one production period in a way that her broader body of public communication does not otherwise exhibit. The indirect accounts that have surfaced about what both of them experienced during the investigation that produced the banned episode come from peripheral sources: crew members who were present but not in the forward position of the investigation, production staff who reviewed portions of the footage during the initial editorial process, and individuals within the research community who were briefed on the findings after the episode was pulled. Those accounts are consistent with each other in their broad outlines and consistent in the specific detail that both Torres and Chobot reached a point during the investigation where their professional frameworks, the scientific methodology Torres applies, and the witness-centered investigative approach Chobot brings, ceased to provide adequate structure for processing what they were experiencing in real time. That detail matters because it is the detail that distinguishes what happened during this investigation from the range of genuinely anomalous experiences both presenters have documented and discussed publicly across the full run of the show. Torres and Chobot have encountered things in the field that challenged them. They have documented phenomena that their respective frameworks could not fully account for, and they have said so on camera without apparent distress. What the banned episode documents is not a challenge to their frameworks. It is the moment their frameworks became irrelevant. The accounts of crew members who were in proximity to both presenters during the relevant sequence describe a quality of response in both Torres and Chobot that those crew members have struggled to articulate precisely. Not fear in the conventional sense, not confusion, but something closer to the sudden and complete recognition that the coordinates by which a person navigates reality have shifted in a way that cannot be shifted back. That is what they walked into, and the cameras caught all of it. The location where the banned episode was filmed has not been publicly identified by any party involved in the production or its suppression. What has been established through the research surrounding the footage's surfacing is a general geographic region and a documented history of institutional attention to that region that predates the Expedition X investigation by several decades. The local population of the area has maintained a continuous oral tradition about the specific site that the production visited, a tradition that describes the location not as haunted in any conventional sense but as a place of permanent and active contact between the physical world and something that exists alongside it without being fully part of it. That description, in various culturally specific framings, appears in the recorded accounts of communities across the region and has been noted by anthropologists working in the area since the mid-20th century without being seriously investigated by any mainstream scientific institution. The institutional interest that the production source referenced was of a different character entirely. The documentation that has partially surfaced through the research surrounding the banned footage indicates that at least 2 separate government-affiliated research programs took an active interest in the site during the latter half of the 20th century. Neither program's findings have entered the public record in any meaningful form. What has surfaced is evidence of their presence, logistics records, communication fragments, and the accounts of local individuals who interacted with outside researchers during those periods, and whose descriptions of what those researchers were doing at the site are not consistent with any conventional scientific survey operation. The Expedition X production was not the first outside organization to send people to that location with the intention of documenting what was there. It was simply the first to bring cameras capable of capturing what those prior investigations had apparently encountered and chose not to put on record. The sequence of events that the banned episode documents begins approximately 40 minutes into the investigation footage, after a standard opening section that establishes the location, the environmental conditions, and the preliminary instrument readings the team recorded upon arriving at the site. Those preliminary readings were anomalous in ways consistent with the location's documented history, but not immediately extraordinary by the standards of what Expedition X had recorded in prior investigations. The electromagnetic variance was elevated. The acoustic environment of the site carried properties that Torres noted on camera were inconsistent with the physical characteristics of the surrounding geography. The instruments were performing the way instruments perform at active locations. Nothing in those first 40 minutes indicates what the following 11 minutes will contain. The transition point is not dramatic in the way television paranormal reveals typically are. There is no sudden spike in a meter, no obvious visual anomaly that the camera catches and the presenters react to. The transition is quieter than that and more disorienting because of it. The quality of the location itself changes. Something in the environmental character of the site shifts in a way that the camera documents in its effect on the people present before it documents any direct visual evidence of a cause. Torres stops mid-sentence during a technical observation about the instrument readings. The silence that follows is not the silence of someone collecting their thoughts. It is the silence of someone whose entire attentional system has been redirected by something that the analytical part of their mind has not yet caught up with. Chobot, positioned several meters away at a different point of the site, turns toward the same area of the location at the same moment without any verbal or visual cue from Torres. What both of them are orienting toward becomes visible on camera approximately 20 seconds after that simultaneous redirection. It is present at the site for the remainder of the 11-minute sequence. It does not behave in any manner consistent with any known phenomenon in the natural world, and it is aware of the cameras. The investigation was concluded without completing its planned scope. The decision to end the field day early was not made by the production team or communicated through the normal chain of on-site decision-making. It was a collective decision that all accounts describe as having been reached simultaneously and without discussion, the same quality of wordless collective understanding that has been described by other teams who have encountered phenomena at threshold locations around the world, and that the anthropological literature on such experiences has documented consistently enough to constitute a recognized pattern. The equipment was packed, and the team left the location within approximately 30 minutes of the relevant sequence ending. The drive back to the nearest populated area was conducted in a silence that crew members have described as different in character from the ordinary quiet of a tired production team at the end of a long field day. Back at the accommodation that night, Torres spent several hours writing detailed field notes that he has never shared publicly. Chobot did not participate in the standard end-of-day production debrief. 2 crew members requested to be rotated off the production for the remainder of the shoot, a request that was granted without the friction such requests typically generate. The physical effects documented in the days following the investigation included sleep disruption reported by multiple team members, episodes of disorientation in the field that persisted for several days after leaving the location, and in one documented case, a medical consultation for symptoms that the attending physician attributed to acute stress response without being able to identify a specific cause. Torres and Chobot returned to production on subsequent episodes and have continued working on the show. What they have never done is discuss that investigation in any public forum. The field notes Torres wrote that night have not surfaced. What has surfaced is the footage, and the footage makes the silence of everyone who was present entirely understandable. The official position of everyone connected to the production and broadcast chain is that the banned Expedition X episode does not exist. No network statement has been issued. No production company acknowledgement has been made. The total nature of that denial is the first indicator that the suppression decision did not originate entirely within the commercial television structure. Discovery Channel has pulled content before, for legal reasons, for sensitivity concerns, for scheduling conflicts that became permanent. In every prior case, the existence of the content was acknowledged even when its broadcast was not. The complete erasure of any official acknowledgement of this episode's existence indicates that the people managing the suppression understood that admitting the episode had been produced would immediately generate questions they were not prepared to answer. The speed of the suppression process suggests outside involvement. The timeline between the footage being reviewed at the executive level and the decision to pull and bury the episode is inconsistent with the operational rhythm of organizations that size moving on purely internal information. Something accelerated the process. The location's documented history of prior institutional interest provides the most direct explanation for what that something was. An organization that had been monitoring that site for decades, that had its own undisclosed findings from prior investigations, and that had a demonstrated interest in managing what entered the public record about that category of phenomenon would have both the awareness to know what the Expedition X footage contained and the capability to ensure it never broadcast. The episode was buried. The footage survived anyway. The copy of the banned episode that has surfaced was preserved by a single individual who was part of the production's post-production process and who made a deliberate decision at significant personal risk to retain a copy of the raw footage before the suppression order reached the stage of the pipeline they occupied. That individual held the footage for an extended period, not from indecision, but from a considered judgment that releasing it prematurely, before the broader conversation around UAP disclosure and anomalous phenomenon had reached a point where the footage could be received seriously rather than dismissed, would waste the only opportunity the footage would have to reach a meaningful audience. The timing of the release reflects that calculation. The footage has been examined by 2 independent digital forensics analysts whose findings confirm that it has not been altered, composited, or manipulated after the fact. The production metadata embedded in the file is consistent with the Expedition X production timeline. The camera unit identification data matches the equipment manifest for the relevant shoot. What has surfaced is the unedited raw output of a professional camera that kept rolling during 11 minutes of an investigation that changed everyone present. It is authentic, it is complete, and it is now in the world in a form that cannot be recalled. Every episode of Expedition X that has ever broadcast represents a fragment of a larger investigation that the show was never permitted to fully complete on camera. Every location Phil Torres and Jessica Chobot visited, every phenomenon they documented, every witness account they treated as worthy of serious examination, all of it exists within a context that the broadcast version of the show was never allowed to fully establish. The banned episode is that context. It is the answer that the entire catalog of the show's fieldwork was accumulating evidence toward without ever being permitted to reach on camera. Torres spent years applying scientific methodology to phenomena that consistently exceeded scientific methodology's explanatory range. Chobot spent years building trust with communities whose generational experience of the world's anomalous edges carries more evidential weight than any institutional research program has been willing to publicly acknowledge. The banned episode is where that accumulated fieldwork finally arrived at its destination. What the footage documents is not a challenge to the existing frameworks by which the modern world understands itself. It is evidence that those frameworks were always incomplete in a specific and consequential way. The phenomenon visible in that 11-minute sequence was not discovered by the Expedition X team. It was not created by the location, or by the investigation, or by the cameras that captured it. It was there before any of them arrived. It has been there for longer than the institutional programs that spent decades studying it have been keeping records. Phil Torres and Jessica Chobot went further than any other paranormal investigation show on television. The banned episode is what they found when they got there. It has been hidden for years. It has now surfaced. And what it shows has been waiting to be seen by enough people that it can no longer be buried. That moment is now. Josh Gates has investigated hundreds of paranormal locations, but there's one Expedition X episode he absolutely refuses to discuss. Season 3 mysteriously skipped from episode 7 to 9. The missing episode was filmed at Poveglia Island in Italy, completed, edited, and then buried forever. Something happened during that investigation that terrified the entire crew. Phil Torres was found in a state of panic with unexplained injuries. A camera operator quit immediately and never worked paranormal TV again. Subscribe now, because what Josh witnessed on that island was so disturbing he made Discovery promise to never air the footage. Dedicated fans of Expedition X who meticulously track every episode, maintain viewing spreadsheets, and follow production schedules noticed something strange when Season 3 began airing in 2021. The episode numbering jumped awkwardly from Episode 7 titled Hunt for the Chupacabra directly to Episode 9 titled The Beast of Bray Road, with no explanation, no acknowledgement, and no Episode 8 anywhere in the lineup. This wasn't a scheduling quirk or out-of-order airing. The episodes were numbered sequentially with an obvious gap that Discovery Plus made no effort to explain or address. Fan communities on Reddit and paranormal investigation forums immediately began speculating about what happened to the missing episode. Some theorized it was simply delayed due to post-production issues and would air later in the season. But when the season concluded with no Episode 8 ever appearing, the speculation intensified. Investigative fans began digging through production databases, filming location permits, and crew social media posts from the time frame when Episode 8 would have been filmed. What they discovered was fascinating. Public records showed Expedition X had obtained permits to film in Venice, Italy, during a specific week in late 2020, and crew members had posted photos from Venice and the surrounding Venetian lagoon during that period before quickly deleting them. One production assistant had posted an Instagram story showing a boat heading toward a distant island with the caption, "Heading somewhere we definitely shouldn't be," before that post was removed within hours. Entertainment industry tracking sites that monitor television production schedules had listings showing Episode 8 was titled The Curse of Poveglia Island and had a scheduled air date that was subsequently removed from all listings. Press releases sent to entertainment journalists about Season 3 originally included a description of an episode investigating Italy's most haunted island, but that description disappeared from later versions of the press materials. When fans began asking Josh Gates directly about the missing episode through social media, convention Q&A sessions, and podcast interviews, his responses were notably evasive and uncomfortable. He would acknowledge the question with forced laughter, make vague comments about not every investigation making it to air, and quickly change the subject. His body language during these moments showed visible discomfort that wasn't typical of his usually confident and open demeanor when discussing his work. Poveglia Island, located in the Venetian lagoon between Venice and Lido in northern Italy, carries one of the darkest histories of any location in Europe, making it both a compelling investigation target for paranormal researchers and a place that many believe should never be disturbed. The island's nightmare history began in the 14th century during the bubonic plague outbreaks that devastated Europe. Venetian authorities used Poveglia as a quarantine station where plague victims were forcibly taken to die in isolation, preventing the disease from spreading further into Venice proper. Conservative historical estimates suggest over 100,000 people died on Poveglia during various plague outbreaks, their bodies burned in massive pyres that created layers of ash mixed with soil across the island. Some areas of Poveglia Poveglia allegedly contained so much human ash mixed into the earth that the soil has a distinctive texture and color. The island's horror continued into the 20th century when in 1922, a mental asylum was constructed on Poveglia, operating until 1968. The asylum's reputation was dark, even by the standards of early 20th century psychiatric care, which was often brutal and inhumane. Local legends claim the asylum's chief physician conducted experimental treatments on patients, including crude lobotomies performed without proper anesthesia, sensory deprivation experiments, and torture disguised as therapy. According to local folklore, the doctor eventually went insane himself, haunted by the ghosts of patients he'd tortured, and threw himself from the asylum's bell tower to his death. Whether this story is historical fact or embellished legend, the asylum's documented history includes hundreds of patient deaths under questionable circumstances. The Italian government closed the asylum in 1968, and Poveglia has remained abandoned ever since. Public access to the island is strictly forbidden by law, with signs warning trespassers of prosecution and fines. The few people who have obtained special permission to visit Poveglia, journalists, historians, and occasionally paranormal investigators with expensive permits, have reported overwhelming feelings of dread, unexplained sounds, and visual phenomena that defied explanation. Local Venetians refuse to visit the island, and fishermen allegedly avoid sailing too close to Poveglia's shores, believing the island is cursed and that disturbing it brings misfortune. This is the location Josh Gates and Phil Torres chose to investigate for what would become Expedition X's most controversial and ultimately buried episode. According to sources close to the production who spoke anonymously because they signed non-disclosure agreements, the Poveglia Island investigation began normally enough, but deteriorated rapidly into what one crew member described as the most terrifying and dangerous situation I've ever experienced in 20 years of television production. Josh Gates and Phil Torres arrived at Poveglia with a full production crew, including camera operators, sound technicians, safety coordinators, and local guides who had reluctantly agreed to accompany them, despite expressing serious reservations about investigating the island after dark. The investigation was scheduled to run from dusk until dawn, following Expedition X's typical format of daytime location exploration, followed by nighttime investigation using thermal cameras, EMF detectors, and audio recording equipment. The first warning signs came during the late afternoon setup when multiple pieces of equipment malfunctioned simultaneously without explanation. Cameras that had been functioning perfectly suddenly died despite fully charged batteries. Audio recorders produced only static, and thermal imaging cameras displayed error messages that technicians couldn't diagnose or fix. The local guides became increasingly agitated, insisting these malfunctions were signs the island was rejecting their presence and they should leave before nightfall. Josh, ever the experienced investigator who dealt with equipment issues and superstitious locals on countless investigations, dismissed these concerns as coincidence and local folklore, pushing the team to continue with the planned investigation. As darkness fell and the team split up to investigate different areas of the island, Josh and one crew exploring the asylum building while Phil and another crew investigated the plague quarantine areas. The situation escalated from equipment problems to genuine danger. Multiple crew members reported feeling physically ill, experiencing sudden overwhelming dread and panic attacks that came on without warning. One camera operator became so disoriented and nauseous he had to be evacuated from the island by boat, unable to continue working. The turning point came approximately 3 hours into the nighttime investigation when Phil Torres' crew heard screaming from inside the asylum building and lost radio contact with Phil himself. When they rushed to his location, they found Phil in an extreme state of distress that sources describe as beyond simple fear. He was incoherent, visibly injured with scratches and bruises appearing on his arms and face, and initially unresponsive to crew members trying to help him. Phil Torres' experience inside the Poveglia asylum building became the incident that ultimately led to the episode being permanently buried, and remains the aspect of the investigation that neither Phil nor Josh will discuss in any detail publicly. According to crew members who were present that night and have spoken anonymously, Phil had been conducting a solo investigation in what was formerly the asylum's surgical ward, a room where the alleged experiments and crude medical procedures had taken place decades earlier. He was wearing a body camera and had radio communication with the production team stationed outside the building, providing periodic updates about his observations and any paranormal activity he might encounter. For approximately 20 minutes, Phil's investigation proceeded routinely. He documented the decaying surgical equipment still present in the room, took EMF readings that showed some elevated activity, and conducted EVP sessions asking questions into the darkness and recording for potential spirit responses. His radio communications during this period were calm and professional, showing no signs of distress. Then suddenly, Phil's body camera footage showed him reacting to something off camera, his expression shifting from curious investigation to genuine fear in seconds. His radio transmission became frantic. "Something just grabbed me. Something's in here with me. I need to get out." The audio captured sounds of Phil moving quickly through the building, breathing heavily, and at one point, what sounded like a physical struggle or collision with something. Then his radio went silent, his body camera feed cut out, and the production team outside lost all contact with him. Crew members immediately entered the asylum to locate Phil, which took several minutes because the building's interior is a maze of collapsed hallways and rooms in various states of decay. When they found Phil, he was in a different section of the building from where he'd been investigating, seemingly disoriented about how he'd gotten there. Most disturbing were the visible injuries on his body, deep scratches running down both forearms that appeared fresh and were actively bleeding, bruising on his chest and shoulders as if he'd been grabbed or struck, and a cut above his right eye. Phil was in an extreme state of psychological distress, speaking rapidly about something that had attacked him in the darkness, something that had touched him with hands that felt wrong, and had whispered things to him that he refused to repeat to the crew. Medical personnel who examined Phil on the boat back to Venice documented his injuries with photographs and could find no environmental explanation for how he sustained them. The raw footage captured during the Poveglia Island investigation allegedly contains material so disturbing and potentially evidential of genuine paranormal phenomena that Discovery Plus's legal team strongly advised against ever airing the episode. Not due to content standards, but because of liability concerns and the possibility that broadcasting such material could traumatize viewers or open the network to lawsuits. Sources who claim to have viewed the raw footage before it was locked away describe several sequences that would have made the episode unprecedented in paranormal television. The most significant footage comes from multiple stationary cameras that had been positioned throughout the asylum building to capture activity from different angles simultaneously. 3 separate cameras, positioned to cover different rooms but with overlapping fields of view and hallways, allegedly captured what appears to be a full-bodied apparition of a human figure moving through the building. Unlike typical ghost footage that shows shadows, orbs, or ambiguous shapes that could be explained as dust or camera artifacts, this footage reportedly shows a clearly defined human-shaped figure that passes through camera frames with apparent physicality and purpose, moving in ways consistent with an actual person walking through the space. The figure appears on all 3 camera angles at times that align perfectly with its movement between rooms, eliminating the possibility of camera malfunction affecting a single device. Perhaps more disturbing is footage from Phil Torres' body camera during the minutes leading up to his panic and the loss of his radio signal. The footage allegedly shows, in night vision mode, Phil turning quickly as if responding to sound or movement behind him, and in those frames, something appears in the background of the shot, a shape or form that moves independently and doesn't match any crew member's position or any reasonable explanation like shadows cast by Phil's own movement. The audio from this sequence reportedly captures sounds that audio engineers who analyzed the footage could not identify or explain. Not typical building settling or wind, but sounds with characteristics suggesting vocalization or deliberate noise creation. Most controversial is a segment of footage from inside the asylum's basement area where temperature readings dropped dramatically, over 30 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 2 minutes. While multiple EMF detectors simultaneously maxed out their measurement capabilities, suggesting an electromagnetic event of intensity that shouldn't occur naturally in an abandoned building. One of Expedition X's experienced camera operators, who had worked with Josh Gates across multiple shows and had participated in dozens of paranormal investigations without incident, made the decision to resign from the production immediately after returning from Poveglia Island, and has refused to work on any paranormal television programming since. The camera operator, whose identity has been protected through anonymous statements he's given to paranormal research communities, described his experience at Poveglia as fundamentally different from every other investigation he'd participated in throughout his career. In his anonymous statement, he explained that he'd always approached paranormal television with healthy skepticism, believing that most evidence captured on shows was either misidentified natural phenomena, equipment malfunction, or occasionally deliberate fabrication by producers seeking dramatic content. His role had always been technical: operate the camera, capture quality footage, and let others worry about interpretation and storytelling. Poveglia changed that perspective completely. According to his statement, what he witnessed and filmed that night convinced him beyond any doubt that genuine paranormal phenomena exists and that some locations should never be investigated because the forces or entities present are genuinely dangerous rather than just subjects of folklore. He described capturing footage that he knows cannot be explained through conventional means, footage he reviewed multiple times looking for rational explanations and finding none. More significantly, he described his own personal experience during the investigation, where he felt an overwhelming presence of malevolence directed specifically at him, as if something intelligent was aware of his presence and wanted him to leave or was considering harming him. The sensation was so powerful and unambiguous that it transcended subjective feeling and became a survival instinct response, every part of his being telling him he was in immediate danger from something he couldn't see or understand. He witnessed Phil Torres' condition after whatever happened to him in the asylum, saw injuries that appeared on Phil's body that had no logical explanation, and heard audio recordings that contained sounds and apparent voices that couldn't be dismissed as environmental noise or radio interference. The combination of these experiences led him to conclude that continuing to work in paranormal television was literally risking his physical safety and potentially his life.
Josh Gates, who is typically forthcoming and enthusiastic when discussing his investigations across Expedition Unknown, Expedition X, and his other projects, becomes noticeably evasive and uncomfortable whenever the subject of the missing Poveglia Island episode comes up in interviews or public appearances. His careful avoidance of the topic is particularly notable because Josh usually embraces discussing even failed investigations, debunked claims, or episodes where nothing paranormal occurred, treating them as learning experiences or entertaining stories about the challenges of paranormal television production. But Poveglia is different, and his response pattern when asked about it reveals that something genuinely disturbing happened that he's either contractually prevented from discussing or personally unwilling to revisit. During a podcast interview in 2022, a listener question directly asked about the missing Season 3 episode and why it never aired. Josh's typically animated demeanor shifted immediately. He paused for several seconds before responding, his voice losing its usual enthusiastic tone and becoming measured and serious. There are some investigations where what we experience or capture on camera crosses lines that I'm not comfortable sharing with audiences. Poveglia was one of those situations. We went to a place with an incredibly dark history, and what happened there convinced me that some locations should be off limits, regardless of their potential for paranormal evidence. When the interviewer pressed for more details, Josh politely but firmly declined to elaborate, stating only that everyone who was there that night understands why the episode won't air, and I've asked the network to permanently archive that footage. At a paranormal convention in 2023, during a Q&A session, an audience member asked if Josh had ever been genuinely frightened during an investigation rather than just experiencing the thrill of exploring spooky locations. Josh's response referenced Poveglia without naming it directly. There's been one investigation where I experienced genuine fear, not the fun Halloween haunted house feeling, but actual terror that something dangerous was present and aware of us. That investigation ended with a crew member injured, and I made the decision to evacuate rather than continue filming. It's the only time in my career I've done that. Body language experts who analyzed video footage of Josh discussing the episode noted consistent stress indicators, reduced eye contact, defensive posture, and verbal deflection techniques that suggested he was protecting information he found difficult to discuss. The Poveglia Island investigation fundamentally changed how Expedition X approaches location selection, safety protocols, and the well-being of cast and crew in ways that became evident in seasons following the incident. Viewers who carefully watch post-Poveglia episodes notice significant operational differences that weren't present in earlier seasons, suggesting the production company and network implemented new policies specifically in response to what happened in Italy. The most obvious change is the addition of a dedicated safety coordinator role that didn't exist in earlier seasons. This person, typically someone with emergency medical training and crisis management experience, is now present at every investigation regardless of location. Their responsibility is monitoring the physical and psychological condition of all personnel during investigations and has explicit authority to halt filming if they determine anyone's health or safety is at risk. This represents a significant shift from the previous approach where production decisions were made by directors and producers focused primarily on capturing compelling content. Location vetting procedures became substantially more rigorous after Poveglia. Earlier seasons of Expedition X featured investigations at locations chosen primarily for their paranormal reputation and visual appeal, with relatively minimal research into the specific history or potential dangers beyond basic historical facts. Post-Poveglia episodes show evidence of much more thorough advanced research, including consultation with local authorities, interviews with previous investigators who visited the locations, and psychological assessments of whether locations have histories so traumatic that investigation might be ethically questionable, regardless of paranormal potential. Several planned investigations for Season 4 were canceled during pre-production, after this enhanced vetting process identified them as too similar to Poveglia in terms of historical trauma or previous investigator experiences. Phil Torres' participation in the show changed noticeably after Poveglia. While he continued working on Expedition X, sources say he initially refused to return for Season 4 and only agreed after extensive conversations with Josh Gates and substantial changes to his contract. These changes allegedly include Phil having veto power over any investigation he deems too dangerous, the right to leave any location immediately if he feels unsafe without production pressure to continue, and the presence of a dedicated safety coordinator who monitors his well-being specifically during solo investigation segments. Episodes filmed after Poveglia show Phil rarely conducting extended solo investigations in the most dangerous or allegedly active areas of locations, a departure from earlier seasons where solo investigation segments were common. Josh Gates has investigated countless mysteries across the globe on Expedition X, from haunted locations to unexplained phenomena. But one investigation ended in a way nobody anticipated. What Josh discovered wasn't paranormal. It was something far more dangerous that triggered international legal action and forced Discovery to permanently ban a completed episode. The find involved organized crime, illegal trafficking, and potential terrorism connections that made broadcasting impossible. Make sure you're subscribed, because what Josh Gates uncovered proves that sometimes reality is more disturbing than any ghost story. The investigation began like countless other Expedition X episodes. A tip from a viewer about unexplained phenomena connected to a mysterious artifact. The email came from an intermediary representing a wealthy private collector in Thailand who claimed to possess a bronze ceremonial mask that had brought nothing but misfortune since he acquired it 5 years earlier. According to the collector, anyone who touched the mask experienced vivid nightmares, unexplained illnesses, and a string of bad luck that defied coincidence. His marriage had fallen apart, his business ventures had failed catastrophically, and multiple family members had died in accidents after the mask entered his collection. He believed the object was genuinely cursed and wanted Josh Gates to investigate its origins and the paranormal activity surrounding it. For the Expedition X production team, this was ideal content. The story combined historical mystery with supernatural claims, offered access to a stunning private collection in an exotic location, and featured a wealthy subject willing to open his home for filming. The collector even offered to pay production costs and provide security, making the episode financially attractive for Discovery. Josh and Phil Torres flew to Bangkok excited about investigating an artifact that allegedly bridged the ancient world with contemporary paranormal experiences. Initial research suggested the mask originated from the Khmer Empire, possibly dating to the 12th or 13th century, making it historically significant beyond its supposed curse. The collector provided documentation claiming he'd purchased the mask legally from a reputable auction house specializing in Southeast Asian antiquities. Everything seemed legitimate, and the production team had no reason to suspect they were walking into an international criminal operation. The first day of filming went smoothly. The collector was charismatic and articulate, describing the mask's history and the tragedies that followed its acquisition. Phil set up monitoring equipment to document any unusual electromagnetic or environmental anomalies around the artifact. Josh examined the mask closely, taking measurements and photographs for later analysis. The bronze work was exquisite, showing craftsmanship consistent with Khmer artistic traditions. But something nagged at Josh as he studied the object. Details about the patina, wear patterns, and stylistic elements didn't quite align with what he'd expect from an artifact that had been properly excavated, documented, and legally sold through established channels. Josh Gates isn't just a television host. He's a trained archaeologist with degrees from Boston University and extensive field experience working on legitimate excavations worldwide. That expertise became crucial on the second day of filming, when Josh began asking detailed questions about the mask's provenance that the collector struggled to answer convincingly. The auction house documentation provided vague details about the mask's discovery location, offered no archaeological context, and lacked the chain of custody information that legitimate antiquities sales require. Josh requested to examine the mask under different lighting conditions and noticed something deeply troubling. The patina, the surface oxidation that develops on bronze over centuries, appeared artificially aged in some areas while genuinely ancient in others. This indicated the mask had been cleaned aggressively after excavation, a common practice among looters who remove dirt and corrosion to make objects more visually appealing to buyers but destroy crucial archaeological evidence in the process. More damning were tool marks on the back of the mask that suggested it had been pried from a wall or structure rather than carefully excavated by professionals. Josh recognized these signs immediately because he'd encountered looted artifacts during his archaeological career and knew exactly what illegal excavation damage looked like. During a break in filming, Josh pulled the producer aside and shared his concerns. This wasn't a cursed artifact legally purchased from a reputable source. This was almost certainly a looted antiquity illegally removed from a protected archaeological site, probably in Cambodia, where Khmer temples face ongoing plundering by organized criminal networks. The collector's documentation was sophisticated forgery, designed to legitimize an object obtained through cultural property theft. If Expedition X continued filming and broadcast the episode, they would essentially be promoting and normalizing antiquities trafficking, potentially violating the UNESCO Convention on Cultural Property Protection that the United States had ratified decades earlier. The producer initially dismissed Josh's concerns as overreaction, arguing they were there to investigate paranormal claims, not audit the collector's acquisition practices. But Josh insisted on verification before continuing. He contacted colleagues at major museums who specialized in Southeast Asian antiquities and sent photographs of the mask and its documentation. Their responses came back within hours and confirmed Josh's worst fears. The mask matched descriptions of objects looted from Angkor-era temples in Cambodia during the chaos of recent decades. When Josh presented the evidence to Discovery's production executives, the response was immediate panic. Legal teams were assembled overnight to assess the network's potential liability for documenting what now appeared to be an international antiquities trafficking operation. The lawyers delivered devastating news. Simply by filming the mask and interviewing the collector about his acquisition, Expedition X had created evidence that could implicate Discovery in facilitating or promoting cultural property crimes. Broadcasting the episode could violate multiple international treaties, including the 1970 UNESCO Convention, potentially triggering criminal investigations and massive fines. The situation escalated when attorneys discovered that Cambodia had specifically listed this type of Khmer ceremonial mask on their national patrimony registry, meaning its removal from the country was explicitly illegal under both Cambodian and international law. The United States had bilateral agreements with Cambodia regarding repatriation of looted cultural property, making possession of such objects on American soil, or even American citizens documenting them abroad, potentially prosecutable under U.S. federal statutes. Discovery faced the nightmare scenario of a television show accidentally creating evidence of crimes that multiple governments were actively working to prosecute. The network's insurance company was immediately contacted and made clear their policy wouldn't cover legal liabilities arising from documentation of criminal activity, even if unknowingly filmed. Discovery would be financially exposed for any lawsuits, fines, or legal fees resulting from the episode's broadcast. The potential costs ran into millions of dollars if multiple governments pursued action. Production was immediately halted. Josh and Phil were instructed to stop filming and avoid any further interaction with the collector that could deepen the legal complications. The crew was confined to their hotel while Discovery's crisis management team coordinated with legal counsel in 3 countries to determine the safest path forward. Footage that had already been recorded was secured as potential evidence rather than broadcast content. The most frustrating aspect for Josh was that his archaeological training had identified a real crime being committed against cultural heritage, but addressing it meant destroying an episode he'd worked hard to create. The Cursed Mask story would have been compelling television, but exposing the truth about its illegal origins had transformed entertainment into evidence in an international criminal investigation that threatened everyone involved. Discovery's security consultants conducted urgent background checks on the collector once the legal investigation began, and what they uncovered was terrifying. The man wasn't just a wealthy enthusiast making questionable purchases. He was a major player in international black market antiquities networks with documented connections to organized crime syndicates operating throughout Southeast Asia. Interpol files linked
linked him to trafficking operations moving looted cultural property from Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos into private collections worldwide. His legitimate businesses provided cover for money laundering activities that cleaned profits from antiquities, sales worth hundreds of millions of dollars. More alarming were his connections to individuals involved in violent enforcement of trafficking operations. Associates had been implicated in threats, assaults, and at least 2 unsolved murders of people who interfered with smuggling routes or cooperated with law enforcement investigating looted artifacts. Discovery's security team warned that exposing the collector's illegal activities on international television could trigger retaliation against the network, the production company, or Josh Gates personally. These weren't empty threats. Organized crime groups protecting antiquities trafficking had proven willing to use violence to maintain their operations and silence anyone who threatened their extremely profitable business. The collector had initially welcomed Expedition X because he believed the episode would add legitimacy to his collection and provide international exposure that enhanced his reputation as a serious antiquities enthusiast rather than a criminal trafficker. Learning that Josh had identified the mask as looted property and that Discovery was considering reporting him to authorities would almost certainly provoke dangerous responses. The network faced an impossible situation. Broadcasting the episode risked legal consequences, while canceling it risked violent retaliation from criminals who'd invested time and money facilitating the production. While examining the collector's private gallery during initial filming, Josh had documented dozens of other artifacts on camera, and subsequent analysis revealed several came from conflict zones where archaeological looting directly funded terrorism and military operations. At least 3 objects matched descriptions of items looted from Iraqi and Syrian sites controlled by ISIS between 2014 and 2017, when the terrorist organization systematically plundered ancient cities and sold artifacts to finance their operations. One alabaster relief fragment appeared identical to pieces stolen from Nimrud before ISIS destroyed the ancient Assyrian city in 2015. Another cuneiform tablet matched descriptions from a batch looted from the Mosul Museum during ISIS occupation. These weren't just cultural property crimes, they represented potential material support for designated terrorist organizations, a federal crime carrying severe penalties including decades in prison. The collector had essentially admitted on camera to purchasing objects whose sale financed one of the world's most violent terrorist groups. Discovery's legal team realized the footage didn't just document antiquities trafficking, it potentially showed evidence of terrorism financing that would interest the FBI, CIA, and Department of Homeland Security. The implications were staggering. Broadcasting the episode could expose ongoing intelligence operations, tracking antiquities-based terrorism funding. It could reveal investigative techniques and compromise undercover agents working to dismantle these networks. Multiple federal agencies contacted Discovery demanding the footage be secured and all information about the investigation be classified to protect national security operations. What started as a paranormal investigation had accidentally documented evidence relevant to counterterrorism efforts spanning multiple continents and involving some of the most dangerous criminal and terrorist networks operating globally. Within 72 hours of production being halted, Discovery found itself coordinating with government officials from 5 countries, all demanding different outcomes regarding the footage and episode. Cambodia's Ministry of Culture insisted all footage be turned over immediately as evidence in their ongoing efforts to recover looted national treasures and prosecute trafficking networks. They threatened diplomatic consequences if Discovery didn't cooperate fully, including potential bans on future filming in Cambodia for any production affiliated with the network. Thai authorities wanted the footage to support criminal prosecution of the collector, who operated his trafficking network from Bangkok, but had evaded charges for years due to corruption and political connections. American law enforcement agencies, including the FBI and Homeland Security investigations, demanded copies of all footage showing artifacts potentially linked to terrorism financing, invoking national security authority that superseded Discovery's control over their own content. The State Department intervened, warning that broadcasting the episode could damage sensitive diplomatic negotiations regarding cultural property repatriation agreements with multiple Southeast Asian nations. Most problematic was Interpol's involvement coordinating an international investigation that Discovery had accidentally compromised by approaching the collector for filming. Undercover operations monitoring the trafficking network had been jeopardized when the Expedition X crew arrived asking questions about artifact origins. Years of investigative of work building cases against dozens of traffickers across multiple countries were potentially ruined because a television show had alerted targets that law enforcement was interested in their activities. Discovery faced potential criminal charges for obstruction of justice if their filming had indeed compromised ongoing investigations. The network hired former federal prosecutors and international law specialists to navigate the crisis. Josh Gates found himself in an ethical and professional crisis that tested everything he believed about archaeology, television, and moral responsibility. As an archaeologist, he had a professional and ethical obligation to report cultural property crimes whenever he encountered them. The Society for American Archaeology's Code of Ethics explicitly requires members to oppose and report antiquities trafficking. Remaining silent about the looted mask would violate those principles and potentially cost Josh his professional credibility within the archaeological community. But as a television host and producer, Josh had contractual obligations to Discovery and responsibilities to his crew, whose livelihoods depended on successful productions. Destroying a completed episode cost the network hundreds of thousands of dollars and damaged relationships with executives who'd greenlit Expedition X based on consistent content delivery. Josh worried this incident could end the show entirely, putting dozens of crew members out of work. The personal safety concerns were equally troubling. Security consultants warned Josh that the collector's criminal associates might view him as a threat who could testify in future prosecutions. International travel became complicated as Josh wondered whether he was now a target for retaliation. His family received security briefings about potential risks, transforming what should have been a routine investigation into something that endangered people Josh loved. The emotional toll was significant. Josh had entered archaeology because he believed in protecting cultural heritage and sharing humanity's past with the world. Instead, he'd stumbled into a situation where doing the right thing meant destroying his own work, potentially ending his show and putting people at risk. He spent sleepless nights questioning whether he should have recognized the warning signs earlier, or whether continuing in television was compatible with his archaeological ethics. Discovery's crisis management strategy involved systematically erasing all public evidence that the banned episode had ever existed. Production schedules released to trade publications were retroactively edited to remove any mention of the Thailand investigation. Episode numbers for the season were adjusted to hide the gap where the banned episode would have aired. Press releases and promotional materials were scrubbed of any references to the investigation before journalists could archive them. Crew members were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements with severe financial penalties for discussing anything about the episode, the collector, or the circumstances surrounding the ban. These NDAs covered not just what was filmed, but the entire legal and security crisis that followed. Violating the agreements could result in lawsuits seeking millions in damages, effectively silencing everyone involved through legal intimidation. The footage itself was secured in a manner typically reserved for classified government material. Hard drives were encrypted, physical copies were locked in secure facilities, and access was restricted to attorneys and executives with security clearances. Discovery created detailed chain of custody documentation, tracking every person who viewed the footage, when they viewed it, and for what purpose. This wasn't just protecting proprietary content, it was managing evidence in ongoing criminal investigations. Despite these efforts, evidence of the episode's existence leaked through production databases and crew social media posts that were captured before being deleted. Reddit users and paranormal investigation forums compiled screenshots, flight records showing the crew in Thailand, and hotel booking confirmations that proved Expedition X had filmed something that never aired. These fragments became the foundation for conspiracy theories about what Josh Gates had really discovered. 6 months after the investigation, Thai authorities arrested the collector following a coordinated international operation involving Interpol, FBI, and multiple Southeast Asian law enforcement agencies. Charges included antiquities trafficking, money laundering, and fraud spanning 2 decades of criminal activity. His entire collection, over 400 objects worth an estimated $200 million, was seized and is currently being repatriated to origin countries. The Khmer mask that started everything was returned to Cambodia's National Museum, where it's now displayed with documentation explaining its recovery from illegal trafficking networks. This incident fundamentally changed how Expedition X vets investigation subjects and locations. The show now employs consultants who conduct extensive background checks on anyone providing artifacts or collections for filming. Legal teams pre-screen objects to verify legitimate provenance before cameras roll. Josh personally reviews documentation for anything connected to archaeological sites or cultural property. The banned episode set a precedent that paranormal television shows must consider legal and ethical implications beyond just entertainment value. Other programs, including Ghost Adventures, Paranormal Lockdown, and Destination Fear, implemented similar vetting procedures after learning about Josh's experience. Insurance companies now require production companies to carry specific coverage for potential cultural property crimes, adding costs but protecting networks from catastrophic liability. Josh rarely discusses the banned episode in interviews, typically deflecting questions with vague statements about investigations that didn't work out or situations better left unaddressed. The few times he's been directly asked, his body language and emotional responses make clear this remains a painful chapter that challenged his identity as both archaeologist and television personality.